Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. The parentheses we learned, we're going to go over it again now, on page 1229. So after a long overview yesterday on essentially the difference between Tchila v'Rechima Tivim and Tchila v'Rechima Sichlim. That means Ava v'Yir, that's natural within us, that we're wired. And this we're talking now by the Nefesh Elikis. The divine soul has emotional, natural connection to godliness. And in two ways. It's the source of its life, chayecha, and like a child, love to a father. However, on that state, it could also be embedded and concealed, just like all the genetic elements of a human being's personality. Comes the second, chima sichlim, literally means ava v'yira. The main emotions are ava v'yira, the emotions that are generated through contemplation, which of course, on one hand, it's not embedded, but on the other hand, it's more mature emotions, because they are already a result of not just how we're born, but through the effort of an adult, or at least a growing adult, a growing child's mind developing and beginning to appreciate things. So the mila that has, the mila, the quality of the natural is that it's part of who you are. So it's not difficult to arouse and awaken because you're already there. Every person naturally wants to live and wants to be connected to the source of life. Every child is naturally loving of its parent. Needs to be made aware, which we'll talk about in a moment. Whereas the Tchila v'Rechima Sichlim does not come as easily, but because it's not our natural inclination, meaning it's not inherent or intrinsic to the soul. On the other hand, however, it's far more powerful because it comes through contemplation and effort, and that has the ability to create a real strong, powerful passion. As I said yesterday, and I repeat again, it's clearly, in Chassidus states clearly, in Tanya, I think he says it, but also in these Maimorim, here, both here and elsewhere, that when it comes from your effort, the power of the emotion is much more powerful because it consumes you. You've invested in it, and it's become something you own through your effort, not because you were born with it. So these are two levels of Tchila v'Rechima discussed in chapter 16 and in chapter 44 in Tanya. It speaks about it in Tanya and several other places, but I'm focusing on those two. Now, here's the next point, and then we're going to go back to the parentheses. The fact is, even when they talk about the natural emotions, as I said, on their own, they remain concealed, like in the state of pregnancy. When a child is fully developed within the mother's womb, it has its whole personality, but it's not obvious. It's not apparent in any way. Even a newborn child, you don't really see it. So he explained, as we learned, that seichel plays a role, and here's where it gets a little more, the plot thickens. Seichel plays a role also in the development of the natural emotions. Number one, to make us aware of them. And the more aware you are, the more the emotion takes hold. So that's why we have the levels mutfa, completely natural and concealed, like he spoke about all the way back on top of page 1223. You have within mutfa itself, you have the chapter 16 in Tanya, that you do have the mind and the heart to appreciate and recognize the value and say it's fitting and appropriate and beautiful to connect to godliness, but it's still not, it's called talume slibay, still more in the recesses of the heart. You sense it, but it's not a full-blown passionate love. That's all the level he called that the level of mutva, but then mutva becomes murgish and it reveals that natural passion. How do you reveal it? Through the awareness that the hisbanunus, benakel, he said, an easy type of contemplation. All you need to be told that there's a treasure right near you, and a person naturally likes to have a treasure. All you need to be told that there's danger near you and you're going to stay away. So you don't need a lot of contemplation. You just need to be made aware. So that is still in the level of mutva, moving to murgish, where you have a feeling, and the feeling is guided by the mind. But it's still all about your survival and your natural instincts, which are now a little more apparent and aware due to seichel. But then in murgish comes the next level, murgish al pi ha-seichel, where now you're not focusing on your survival, you're focusing on godliness itself, how God creates existence, and that how God is beyond existence. It still all relates to existence, but you're thinking not about you and what God does for you. You think about how God creates, the process of creation. That was the 4 different contemplations he mentions he discussed on page 1228. To sum them up again, one was the first one, how and all of existence is only a reflection of the divine, malchuscha malchus kol elamim, and that the divine is removed and is not affected by existence. Even the concealment is only a concealment on outer dimensions of the divine. That was the first thing. Everything comes from the words of God, and that creates an ava v'tshuka, because you want to connect to this godliness. The second thing he said was when Mizbein B'Gedulas Hashem, in the Inyan Nifla Ma'id, how wondrous it is, the actual process of creation. And still it's only Oisapel, it's only like an action compared to Abish, it's a trivial thing compared to him. The third thing was Isbonus Be'eza Saga, specific divine level, Eris and Kalim, or Esesphiris, or the Oelamus Atzilus, and so on. And finally, Ubafrat, he said, when you contemplate on the greatness of God, that with all the multitude of the entire cosmic order from top to bottom, how that God created all that multitude and how it's all nullified before him. All this arouses now a love that was not natural to you. Because let's not talk about your natural desire for life or your natural connection as a child to a father. Now, one more point that I wanted that yesterday I didn't fully develop is this. When you look in Tanya, he makes it clear, and we'll learn it inside, and I'll spell it out, that there's also, when it comes to the natural love, it can be natural, like we said, and you don't feel it. It's just there, and you act accordingly. A child will listen and be obedient to his father, to his or her parent. There's no necessarily appreciation. Then there's thinking about it and appreciating your parent. Same thing with life. We can be alive and not appreciate life. But now you're appreciating. In this context, godliness, that God is like our source of life and our parent. So you're aware of it. So the awareness creates some stimulation in the heart, in the mind and the heart, in contrast to something that's completely behavioral and doesn't have any feelings at all. But then when you read on in Tanya, he says that they could also have even a deeper element. It's called abizgalus liboy. Not just betalumas love, it's not just an emotional awareness like we spoke in chapter 16, but there's also izgalus liboy, that you actually feel it in a passionate way. And here there seems to be a little overlap, because now, even though it's natural emotions, but they are also now, you're passionate about it. But then in Tanya, in chapter 44, he says, and yet it doesn't, that natural love, because it's natural, doesn't compare to something that comes through passionate fire love. So the Rebbe has a footnote where he explains in Tanya that conceptually you can also reach a level of ava karish be'esh, even in natural love, not just in tchila v'rechim sichlim, which is what it's the simple interpretation is that cognitive emotions can arouse a deep passion. Like I mentioned yesterday, romantic love, for example, in the contrast to sibling love. It's far more passionate than sibling love. Sibling love is more ava kamayim. It's love like water. But you want passionate love, that comes when you create that through your connection to somebody that was not naturally your relative even. Just using it as an example. So in that sense, you would think that passionate love is not possible when it comes to natural biological, or what I called before the natural love. So the Rebbe says that that's not the case. And it seems when you read Tanya, it seems that you have to say that you can also have a deeper level of love, even when it comes to natural emotions. But it still doesn't compare to the emotions that are created through the mind that are not natural. So clearly let's put it in the natural itself, therefore there would be three levels. Completely concealed, talumas libai, like in chapter 16, where your mind and your heart feels the importance, but it's not yet internalized in the sense where it's revealed, passionate, and a passionate feeling toward that natural love. You could have that. And then comes the Tchila v'Rechima Sichlim, which is created by the mind, and that's a stronger level. And in that itself, we're going to learn that there are two levels. There's a level where it's still murgish al pi haseichel, it's still connected to midas, and then we're going to learn a level primis hameichin, where the mind becomes far more powerful and more dominant. But that's going to come afterwards. So with that said, I want to go back now to the parentheses, and you'll see how this plays itself out in the language of this mimer. And then I'll stop if anybody wants to get more clarity on this topic. So in the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab said that the Seiris Ava Boy de Asog is bonus. I'm reading on top of page 1229. We read it yesterday, but I'm going over it again. So we're talking about Ava that comes through comprehension and contemplation. Not one that is naturally there, that you're just becoming aware of your own natural love for life or for the divine Father, God, the God. So he says in Tanya, Sefer Shabbein in Perek Mem Daled, he says, the Ava Shaidei is bonus, the Chi'ata Avinu v'Chihu Chayecha, which is not the bonus we talked about here, about God's way of creating existence and all that, the four different things I mentioned earlier. We're talking about that the hisbonus, that Ato Avinu, that you are our Father, and Hu Chayecha, Chihu Chayecha, and God is our life, our sustenance. They're not called emotional love and awe and fear only when they are in Meiche Machshavte, as he explains, Kamoi Hamavur Beperik Tazayim. That second level. In other words, the first level, it's true, they are natural midas, but you can't call them yet effective because they're not even revealed. They're just embedded like a seed in the ground. But when they're b'meiche machshavte, you won't call them chinuch only when they're meiche machshavte. However, they move now to another level. Aval kashem bizgalas libe, level 3, that when a person really contemplates and thinks about how God, I'm going to use the language in Tanya. This is the language in Tanya, because this is clearly what he's saying. He's quoting from chapter 44. So I want to just read it inside because it's very, it'll help, I think, understand this. He says like this. I'm reading chapter 44 in Tanya. And its place is in Bria. I'm just skipping a few words. Not just Yitzira, which is the world of emotions, but the world of intellect, cognitive. Because drawing them out, these natural feelings, drawing them out from their concealment in the heart, that they should be revealed, it's through das, which we know is an intimate, connected relationship with the idea, not just bina, chachma bina, which can be conceptual, but das, v'tkiyas ha'machshava b'chezik, immersing, investing even more. A tkiya would be really in wedging the mind in an intense way with his bonus atzuma, with a very intense contemplation. Ma'umka deliber, from the depths of the heart, yatir, even more, v'todir, more and all and permanently in Ein Sof Baruch Hu, eichu chayenu mamish, how God is literally our very life. Without God, you have no life. Va'avinu ha'amiti Baruch Hu, and our true Father. So that, he says, now it's Vizgalas Liboy, he says that is called Rusa de Libo. That's more than just the chilav tivim. This has now already reached a level of passion and so on. That's what he says here. Then he adds in Tanya, then in addition to that, you get the avarabba from Atzilus. Remember that avarabba that comes as a gift, not through our effort. Once we have this effort, it comes the avarabba. And nevertheless, he says you still need to have the contemplation. Because you could say, 1 second, since we both have the natural love, and we also have the gift from the gift that becomes part of us. So why is it so important, the contemplation? He says, because the contemplation brings it alive. If you don't make that effort, then it's basically essentially like every creature has its natural tendencies. That brings it alive in a fiery way. And that's where the Rebbe has the footnote that fiery way can also be applied even to speaking about the God as our Father. I'm thinking of reading the Rebbe's footnote, but I want to first finish the parentheses, and then maybe I'll read the footnote. It'll help a bit understand this. So here's what he says: the Avashai is one of the Chiyata Avinu, and that is only called Chiruchim Mativim. Aval Kashein Bizgalus Libe. That's the language in Tanya that I just read. Nikroim Reusa Deliba. This is called Reusa Deliba, the desire of the heart, which is a deeper level than just natural emotions, even when they're revealed somewhat in the mind and the heart. V'nira, says the Rebbe Rashab, Shezeh b'chinas avos elam shebeperek mem gimel, and it seems that this is the level of avos elam in chapter 43, where he speaks about the love that God gives as a gift, and there's the love that we earn through our effort. She says this is the level that is galus libe, and he refers to Ayin Nizbar Liel Dibra Maskal El Shmeis. And now the Rebbe Rashab is reconciling that with what it says here in this mimer. Based on the Tanya, so now the Tanya the Tanya speaks about Chayecha and Ata Avinu and Chayecha. Here, the Rebbe Rashab called that Murgish, the Murgish of Midas. And it seems that this is called the level of Teva. So the Rebbe Rashab says like this, and according to what's explained here, Shakavon Sham, here in this mimer, that the intention there in Tanya, that when he talks about the natural emotions, which the mind and the heart already are aware of, not necessarily as galus libre. We're not talking about that it's fully filled the heart in a revealed way, but the awareness of chapter 16 in Tanya, what he called earlier part of Nihi, part of Mutva, he says you have to say this is the level of Mutva. The Samach Tzedek in that mimer I again explained yesterday, there's a famous mimer in Eretz Mishpatim, he says that's what it says there as well, that this is the level of Mutva, first level. And the second level that Tanya talks about, he says when it comes into revealed in the heart and you really feel it emotionally, not just that it's appropriate and fitting, Yeyosa, but rather you feel it, he says that's the level of Murgish. But we still, if you go back to the page before, he said Murgish, okay, fine, you feel it. But you're still talking about the love of life, Chayecha, and Ata Avinu, or the other order, Ata Avinu Hu Chayecha. The Rebbe Rashab said on the previous page that the seichel, amurgish mitzad seichel, is higher than that. He says clearly that seichel hu rakshim is ben shezel achayes shalei. That's mirgish shebemidas. The murgish mitzad seichel is when you begin to contemplate on godliness, not as it is your source of life or is your father, but godliness as godliness is on God's terms, so to speak, relatively speaking. So where does that fit in here? And in Tanya, it appears that he is talking about that as well, because he talks about a fiery love that comes from contemplation, which seems to be more than the contemplation that God is your father and your life source. So the Rebbe Rashab continues now and says, at that level, the gam b'chinas hamurgish shemitzad haseichel, ima yesha midas hein sichlin, even though now we're talking about emotions that are not natural to you, the love of your father and the love of your life, of your sustenance. The sichlim, nikra kan tivim. Here, kan, it seems to be, kan would be here in the mimer here, but you could also say, does he mean it in the nikra kan tivim? They're called natural. Why are they called natural? When they're not the natural that are embedded in us. So the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain two reasons why they're called tivim. Now, I don't think he means the tivim of what he says in Tanya tivim. I think kan tivim meaning, in the whole context here, they're the level of tivim. It's a little confusing because he just said mutfa and murgish. So when he says tivim, it seems to mean the chila v'rechima tivim, and he explains why they call tivim, because at the end of the day, they still are connected to your emotions. They're not the mind contemplating on the divine as completely disconnected from existence. That's what it seems like he's answering. He says, echad, why are they called natural? Because they're the meichin that relate to midas. So in other words, we're not talking about the natural wired feelings toward a father or toward life, sustenance. So though you're talking about a contemplation about the way God created existence and all the different levels, and how everything is just a reflection, or every specific level, so it is true you're dealing with seichel, but it's a seichel around how God creates. So therefore, it still connects to somewhat to midas. And that's why the primary thing is midas. That's why he calls it tivim. And the second reason, Beis mipnei shamidas hein kil todasa, because the midas have not been changed. If you're a person who's naturally chesed, you're still chesed. Like we said, the nefesh alikis, there's different, every souls have different personalities. This contemplation in what he calls murgish mitzad midas doesn't change you from being a soul that identifies more with chesed or another one with more with the gvura. It's just directing those emotions to be awakened toward godliness. So it seems to me that he's adding now that even the level of murgish mitzad seichel, which is not about our natural love that is embedded and ingrained and intrinsic within us, that even the one that contemplation that comes, like he said in the previous page, his bonus idea, his Chassidus idea, his bonus of the key, even that ultimately is connected somewhat to emotions. I think we'll understand this better when we read on, because he's going to speak to at another level of moichin, which is called muskel, full muskel, not just murgish al pi haseichel. No, it's not just feelings, but you're going to go into understanding godliness that's completely removed from existence. I think once we understand that, we'll be able to understand this end of this parenthesis better. But I have to tell you, I don't fully grasp what he's saying here. I think this is the pshat the way I just explained it, but it's pretty short and dense, so it's hard to fully understand. But I think once we learn on, will become clear. So with that, I conclude the parentheses, and then we'll continue learning. And I think, as I said, things will come clear. But I will stop if anybody wants to clarify anything, because this has been a little, a broader presentation on this whole section. I will say one more thing, that in Tanya, he connects it with Gan Eden as well. So when you learn the Tanya, you suddenly realize, because Gan Eden, which is the topic that all this began with, is the place where all these levels of our avodah are revealed. Gan Eden HaTachten, Gan Eden HaElyon is the difference between Yetzirah and Bria. So the work, when you work with your natural emotions, it reveals the divine in Gan Eden HaTachten. When you work with the cognitive emotions, it reveals the divine in Gan Eden HaElyon. Gan Eden is the revelation of these levels that we work on today through our efforts. All the levels we're speaking about, Gan Eden is the place, the repository, where all that is stored and ultimately revealed for the neshama to have anog from the Gili Ziva Shechina. He does speak about that earlier in Tanya, chapter 39 and on. So just for the record. Okay, let me stop here. If anybody wants to clarify anything.
What's the difference between the hisbonenus that takes the, I guess, the excitement or the stimulation of the feelings of the midos from being just, I guess it would be murgush mitzara midos to, and then it says there's a gift of avaraba, and that takes you to, again, this is very dense, but takes you to a higher level of excitement, of stimulation. But that jump it requires some contemplation. So that's a form of hisbonenus. And then beyond that, there's a further hisbonenus, it seems he's saying, that takes you, I guess, to a fiery passion, something even greater, that which is murgush mitzara sechel. But it seems that there's some level of hisbonenus that in both of those leaps, if you will. One is before avaraba, and then after avaraba, there's more hisbonenus.
No. Avaraba is not discussed here. In Tanya, it talks about avaraba. I'm not clear what levels you're talking about. I mean, I spelled out this natural love that you have. For example, the love a child has to a father, even when he's aware of it, which is great, is never going to be as passionate as when he's aware of something that's completely beyond him. Because at the end of the day, the mere fact that it's natural tends to somewhat mute and tame the intensity of the love. Where do you get the intensity of love is when you start thinking about things that are beyond you. That's where the seichel, sichlim comes in. Cognitive emotions, where you're contemplating on God that's beyond. As long as it's part of who you are, so yes, it creates a love and you're drawn to it and you want to have that life, but it's going to be less passionate. What the Rebbe in his footnote says, that when you think about God as something, even as your father, he's beyond you, the haflah, the wonder, it could awaken something that's more passionate. So that's the natural versus that which is created and manufactured and generated through cognitive. That's what I said. I'm not clear what other contemplations you're talking about. That's all I really spoke about.
Well, okay, so one contemplation, and I'm sorry if I mixed
one
terms.
Is about your natural love, in other words, like a child to a father, or the natural love to your sustenance, source of sustenance. And one is thinking about God, like we said, murgish mitzara seichel, where you think about godliness, the four different contemplations we spoke about. That's the two contemplations we're talking about here.
Okay, that clears it up. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Rabbi that he talks about in Tanya says that after that comes something that God gives as a gift, which is an even deeper level of connection. It would be like almost when the child really appreciates the father in a deep way, the father will respond and reciprocate, for example, and it will create even a deeper connection. He doesn't say that explicitly, but that would be an example of Rabbi. That's like a response from the father back to the child. But the thing that I have been struggling with is the contemplation about the natural or the contemplation that's not. And here he seems to be talking almost like conflating the two. Any other questions?
Right.
If not, I was going to read the Rebbe's footnote because that may be helpful here.
No, that was great.
What? I'm sorry?
Are you finished? Rabbi, are you finished?
Yeah, no, that was, I'm in the same mental place as Rabbi Jacobson, that I understood what he just said, but there is some confusion about conflation. But it doesn't matter. You explained it as well as you can right now. So yes, I'm done. Thank you.
Where are you going to put the level in Tanya about Ezu Chosid Mischased in Koinoi, that everything that you want is only the Eibishter? And it brings the example from a son, Kivod Ishtadil Bosar Avui Ve'imei, Derochim Loin Yeser Megarmei, a son that cares so much for his father and mother that he loves them more than he loves himself, and he will sacrifice himself to take them out from jail or what. This is the highest level that the Alter Rebbe is saying there.
Well, that's from Perek Yud. That's from chapter 10 in Tanya, talking about the tzaddik. Everything we've been talking about is about the Beinoni. The tzaddik, yes, reaches a higher level. In chapter 44, he speaks that the kibrod de mishtadl is actually used on Moshe Rabbeinu. The Zohar uses that mashal on Moshe. So in chapter 44, he talks about it. That's Moshe. On the other hand, he says every Jew, we all have that relationship with God. So the Rebbe has footnotes on this topic. Since it's not in the context of Ayin Beis, I refer you to Shiur in Besefer Tanya on chapter 44 in Tanya, where he speaks the Kibra Mishtadl, there's levels in it. Like even here in Ayin Beis, Kibra de Mishtadl, which means like the son that loves his father, he equates that with Hu Chayecha, that God is our sustenance. In Tanya, he actually says Kibra de Mishtadl is a higher level. But in that itself, there's a difference. For example, the difference in a tzaddik who is a ben and serves God like a child, like Moshe Rabbeinu, and a regular soul that serves, obviously there's a big difference. We're focusing more which is the Dover Hashav L'chol Nefesh. The question is, since it's on Moshe, why does he say it's Yerushalayim Aviseinu? And the Rebbe speaks about that in a note as well in chapter 44 in Tanya. So basically, it's a higher level in the Kibra. The level we're talking here is actually a much lower level, because here we're talking about the natural love that every child has to his father. In this case, every neshama has a natural love, nefesh elikis, to the divine. He could be aware of it, he could not be aware of it. That's the main focus in chapter 44 and also as well as here. That's where I would place it, okay? Good. So I want to read the Rebbe's note. It's just a very interesting note, which helps understand, because here we've been contemplating about the natural love to your source of sustenance and to God as a father. And in contrast to contemplating on godliness and how God creates existence and how everything is just a reflection compared to God. So here's what the Rebbe says. In the Tanya itself, as I said, when it came to his Galus Liboy, he does say, I just read inside, the strong passion with Das and Yitaka Bechezek and all that, of appreciating God as our Father and our source of sustenance. So the Rebbe writes in a footnote like this. This is in chapter 44, and I'm reading from, the Rebbe wrote this note when Rabbi Weinberg taught Tanya on the radio, which I'm doing now, I'm continuing that tradition. So the Rebbe edited all the classes that he gave. So when he wrote, the Rebbe edited and said the following. The Alter Rebbe writes, just put it in context, even though you have one second, even though you already have Ava V'yira Tivim, and you have even more Ava V'yira Sichlin, you also get the gift of Ava Rabbah. So now you have both qualities. You have the natural, and you have that which comes through effort, through contemplation. So basically, you have Yitzira, Bria, and Atzilus. Atzilus is Ava Rabbah. Tchila v'rechima sichlim is Bria. Tchila v'rechima tivim is Yitzira. Raksha afal pikein, says the Alter Rebbe. However, nevertheless, tzorich litroich b'sichli lahasigu la'agia gam l'bchinas avos elam hanal. You need to exert yourself. Litroich b'sichli, to exert your mind. Lahasigu la'agia, to reach and to lahasig, to understand, and to reach also the level of avos elam, which means you have to also contemplate. You can't just rely on your natural. That comes, the ava that comes from thinking about the greatness of God. So right here, greatness of God is not your source of sustenance and your father, seemingly. And that's why it comes completely from contemplation. It's not what your natural connection to the source of sustenance and Ata Avinu, your father. Why? Says the Alter Rebbe, why do you need it? Kedei lahagdil meduras eish ha'ava b'rish be'eish v'shalheves aza. In order to strengthen, to intensify the meduras eish, the torch of fire of the love, berishbei eish, of the fiery flames of the love, the shalheves aza, and a very powerful shalheves flame or torch. The lava ela shamaima, and a flame that goes up to heaven. At shamayim rabim la yuchlu lichves, to the point that even many waters, which means any distractions, cannot extinguish this fire. In other words, it's not just a fleeting or a passing love. It's fire that cannot be extinguished. V'naharis lo yishtafuha, and rivers cannot, cannot overwhelm it, cannot put it out, extinguish it. So this is the power that comes when a person really is contemplating on the divine, more than just their natural wiring. He says, there's a quality and advantage of this love that comes like fiery flames, and a powerful torch, that comes from the contemplation, from the mind, from the tfuna, from bina and das, in the greatness of godliness. Which means how God is beyond just being your source of sustenance and being your father, which is greater than the shtei b'chinas ava now on the two levels of ava, which is the source of sustenance and being your true father, kasher einon kirish be'esh v'shalheves, when they are not in a state of flaming fire and torched, like a torch. So here is where the Rebbe puts a footnote. Why does the Alter Rebbe add a kasher einon kirish be'esh v'shalheves? If they're fundamentally not capable of passion, it should have just said, this contemplation, this love that comes in a fiery, passionate way through contemplation about the divine, the greatness of the divine, the hafla, the wonder and grandeur of God, is greater than the two loves of love of sustenance of life and love of Father that comes from the natural. But he adds kasher einon, when they're not in a state of fire. So the Rebbe derives from that, and it's a brilliant diuk in the Alter Rebbe, that you have to say that they're also capable of reaching a flamey fire, meaning even the natural. So I'm going to read the Rebbe's footnote now. The Rebbe's gloss and note that he writes on this piece in Tanya, because I think it will help understand the context of the different types of contemplation we're discussing here. So here's what the Rebbe says. And I'll translate it. The Rebbe says, he says here, the Alter Rebbe says here, when these two levels of love, the love of the sustenance of life, of the source of life, and the Father, he says, when they're not in a state of flamey fire, fiery flame, because here in Tanya, he's talking about these two levels of love that are the natural love, when they're not in a state of a fiery flame. However, says the Rebbe, if you, through your effort, can bring this natural love to a state of revelation by contemplating how great your Father is, not just that he's your Father, but how great he is. You can bring that this love should be also fiery flame. And then they also have the advantage because the value and the beauty of the Father, when you realize that your Father is not just your Father. Every child loves their father.
Not kiyakar, biyakar tiferes gedulosa.
What did I say?
You said the chof. He has an understanding in yakar of tiferes gedulosa.
That's what I'm saying. Ki yakar tiferes ha'av me'erat semayim. So every child has a natural love to their parent. But imagine you have a parent that's really something extraordinary. So then when you contemplate on that, that value also awakens at Simoin. So even though the natural love to a parent would not create a thirst, it creates a love. But this passionate fire that comes only from something that's beyond you, when the Rebbe is saying that even with a parent, if you think about it in that fashion, obviously he's talking about God. That even God as a father also has an element of a flaw. And then the Rebbe continues, Ha'izbonus hanakuda. The punchline, the Rebbe now sums up. Ha'izbonus b'chlal, Beis izbonus. There are two types of contemplation, b'chlal, in general. Echad, one, ba'afla, umevir gili, ba'afla, in the wonder and the grandeur, which we're talking about now, which creates fire. Umevia, and it brings gili or yeloda, either reveals or gives birth to, depending what the contemplation is about, the tzemoyin v'rish be'esh, to a thirst and a fiery flame. And clearly the Rebbe is referring to both types of his bonus. Gilui would be revealing the love that a child has to a father, God as a father. Yeloda would be if it's just contemplating on God's in general grandeur and wonder. So that's one. And the Rebbe continues, but Maimori ad Munish Mesedim, in the Maimorim of the Rebbe Rashab, like the Maimor we're learning now, Meisiv Bekama Mekemas, he adds in a number of places, Shekain Gamkein Mizbonnus Berichuk, that this too comes from a contemplation when you recognize the distance of something from you. When you recognize its closeness, it's a love that's compared more to water. It's a calm type of love. When you recognize something that's beyond you, creates a lot of tzemoyin, a lot of thirst. Like we learned, if you remember in the previous volume about chelas ava, that when something is very distant, you long for it. You long for it. But that is only possible when you feel the wonder and the grandeur, not when you feel that it's close to you. So the natural love of child to parent, or to God as our parent, is not necessarily in this fiery state. Beis bikiruv. The second contemplation is when you think of the closeness, umevia lekiruv, and that brings you to feel close to it. That would be like the ava kemayim. That's the ava that's like water. Now the Rebbe says more. I could read till the end of the note. It's a little more, but okay, I might as well read it. He says, Beis teitzois efsharius mizbonnus. There's two possible outcomes of this contemplation. Ezamanal, either of the two that I just mentioned. One from the distance and wonder of God, and one from God's closeness, which again would be the natural love would usually be closeness, but the Rebbe points out it could also have the passion of something that's beyond. And the one al pi seichel, the one that's the chilus rechimus sichlim, the one that comes exclusively through contemplation, is for sure about the grandeur of God. But there too could be kiruv. You could also talk about God as He's close to you, which relates more to the natural love. So he says two outcomes. One, av yira shebehelam. One is a love and an awe or fear that's hidden, concealed. Teva Yerusha, the nature, that which we have by our birthright. This is what he's talking about, Chila v'rechim tivim. And the Av, what the Hizbonus does, maybe also legili, it brings it, it reveals it, it brings it into a state of revelation, like we've learned. Two, Helodas Ava, it can give birth to a love, a yira. And that is when the Hizbonus is in something that's not something that's natural to us. That's what it seems like the Rebbe is saying. And then the Rebbe just adds as another, one more point. Ulahoyer means, and one can remark, hafla hanal tzarich lis hafla be'erech. The wonder and grandeur that I'm mentioning above has to be something that's still in your domain. Because if it's completely about God, that's completely beyond us, then it does not bring love and fire. Then its outcome would be bittul. which means complete nullification. Here we're talking about love and a relationship. The question is it a love to something that's close to you and a calmer love, or is it a more passionate one, a more exciting one? But if it's really talking about something, how God is completely beyond, then the result would be bittul. And the same thing, l'richuk. When you talk about the distance of God, the distance also has to be somewhat commensurate if you're going to want to create love. Because if you find out that God is completely beyond, then it's not a matter of love, then it's a matter of I'm completely nullified in that presence, which I believe is going to help us understand the continuation of Ayin Beis. So it's interesting how all this is intertwined, the Tanya with Ayin Beis and now the Rebbe's footnote. So that's the note of the Rebbe, which, as you see now, why it could be quite important to understand the context of everything here.
Where did you read it? In Shiurim Limud Sefer Tanya?
Chapter 44. Chapter 44, yes. Yeah.
This high fiery love that we experience through the Hispanos, or the Rebbe in the footnote was talking about. What's the difference between that and Avarava? I don't get it.
Avarava is nothing to do with your avoid. Avarava is a gift that God
I
gives.
understand, and this isn't necessarily. It's not. But what is the difference in the fiery outcome? In
You can only reach that far.
Water
A human being can only reach that far in their effort.
But that's a tremendous level he's talking about. Right now, it said it can't be extinguished by water.
That's all. That's as much as you, human being, can reach.
That's a very, and then Avarava is higher than this. Wow, it's incredible. I can't even start to understand it. So.
Yeah. Well, Avarabba, like I said, to use the example, all this is your effort in loving. And then when God responds, so God's response is coming like, you can love your spouse this way, but the spouse has to reciprocate. And that's when it reaches another level.
What is the point? It's the distinction
anyway,
between.
Remember, I'm not teaching Tanya here. I'm only using the Tanya to explain Ayin Beis. If you really want to learn about Avarabba, you have to go to chapter 43 and 44 and learn it more in depth. I'm not really going into that. He's not really speaking about that here.
So the
maybe
Rebbe,
maybe he will, but so far not.
So the Rebbe said that if you contemplate on how distant the berichuk that the Eibishter is, sort of, then it instigates a greater love than if you think of the Eibishter as someone very, very close, he said. But on the other hand, if you think about God as being too removed, too far away, then you get to the place of bittul. So what is the and I know I'm asking, maybe you don't know the answer, but how do you contemplate God in a way that he's far, that it inspires a deeper love, like we said about cholas ava, versus thinking about God is so far away that it inspires bittul. What would be the two different types of contemplations?
So first of all, we're going to be learning about this. That's why I read it. We're going to be learning plenty about this as we go on the next pages. Secondly, it's really the central theme of Ayin Beis. Every interface needs to have a relationship of two entities. On one hand, the relationship has to be one that we can relate to, meaning das Tachten, we relate to on our terms. On the other hand, the interface has to be on God's terms, and these two have to meet. But when you go higher and higher, you come to points where God is completely beyond and there's no relationship altogether. So relationship is defined by closeness and respect. That would be the kiruv and the richuk here. So the closeness is the intimacy, the closeness, like God is our Father, our source of life. What God does for you, which is still on your survival terms, what we called here TV, mutva. And then there's appreciating God as the creator, like we said, the 4 different types of contemplation that he elaborated on, that all of existence is only like a reflection, the wonder of creation itself, the different levels of the Iris and Kalim and so on. But you're talking there about a God that is engaging with existence, however, he's beyond existence. And you're seeing the wonder of God, not as he's your sustenance, but as God is creating in his masterful way. It's like being in awe of an artist, but not as the artist is serving you. The artist as being such a great artist, like we're describing here in these different 4 contemplations. And then there's God is not even defined by being an artist altogether. He's altogether not anything like relates to existence, as we're going to learn. And the higher you go, the more, less, that won't be so much ava, that would be what the Rebbe would call bittul. But this is, we've talked about this at length so many times about Ayin Beis. This is essentially the levels. You first start with Das Tachten, on our terms. You go to Das Elyon, or what he called the Yesha Nivra, and you reach the Ayin of the Yesha Nivra on our terms. Then the Ayin of the Yesha Miti, as it's the Ayin of the Yesha Miti, and all the way higher and higher till you get to points where the divine is completely beyond. But this is the whole Seder Shtalshus. It all consists of all these different types of relationships. So it begins, as I said, you start with yourself, and slowly you're absorbing and assimilating more of Elikus. Like, for example, just the mere fact of talking about before the Tzimtzum is bittul. Before the Tzimtzum, there are no relationships, because there is no 2 entities. There's only godliness, just as an example. But we're going to learn about this, but it's really the central theme of Ayin Beis.
That was extremely helpful. Thank you very much.
It's like the difference between Ava, the high Ava Elah, and finally you get to what is Bittul Zira Elah, which is the highest level. Is that what we're talking about? That love relationship, you need 2 people, I mean, 2 entities, and you get to that place where you're so Bittul, it's called complete Yira, where there's nothing except Bittul. And am I characterizing it right?
Well, there are many levels, but generally speaking, Ava is more Chiruv and Yira is more Richuk in general. But here we speak about Ava, both levels as well, like water or like fire. But Yira is in Tanya chapter 43, and prior to that, starting in chapter 39 and 40, 41, 42, 43, he talks about the 2 levels of Yira as well, Yira Tata and Yira Elah. So generally, Yira Elah, yes, is considered a very high level of bittul. And it's after you have Yira that comes usually the levels of Ava, but the high level of Yira. So yes, Yira is a level of bittul, but it all comes down to what level you're talking about. There's definitely a state where you completely don't think about yourself at all, and it's completely being absorbed in the source. Whereas Ava, there's still some relationship that you want it, you love it. Yes, you want to connect with it. If you remember again, volume 2 at the end, you spoke about Chelas Ava was a state where the love is so intense because you contemplated so much about those higher levels of the divine that you long, you ache, you're literally sick, love sick, because you want it and you don't have it. So I'm sure that relates to some of these levels. I don't know yet which level relates to what. I want to leave that once we learn more, and we'll see if we can connect the 2. I just mentioned it because we learned about it, so I'm referring to it.
Then there's the danger of the parties like the Rabbana, the rabbis that didn't make it out because they were just so bittul that they didn't. Rabbi Akiva was able to hold on.
Yeah, listen, I'm careful not to connect. You want to connect it to everything because you have to start. Is that Yira? Is that Ava? Right now, let's just keep focusing where we are right now. We're talking about the awakening of a love that comes from contemplation or that's natural. We're moving through the stages of Mutva, Murgish, and Muskal. That's the key thing to keep in mind. Keep focused where we are right now. Obviously, it overlaps with and spills over into many other themes. So I'm just trying to keep focused here as much as careful. My goal was not just to bring more ideas into this. I felt that we have to have the Tanya to understand what he says in this parentheses. That's really why I went into this whole elaboration, because there's no way you can understand this parentheses without knowing what he says in Tanya, because the whole thing is based on Tanya. That's where I really went into. So now, let's see here. I'm going to read a few lines after the parentheses just to make sure we get the flow right. So after the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab continues. So he said, that was the first line of the paragraph. The parentheses discussed what this Hasog of Izbanus is and the different levels that it creates and what's Teva, and basically explaining that it's all ultimately Tivim, whether it's Mutva or Murgish. And the Murgish Mitzad HaSeichel. Okay. Murgish. Avir Bizgal is a Murgish. So Murgish would be the strength of feeling where you are focusing on God as Father and sustenance. And Murgish Mitzad HaSeichel is talking about godliness, but it's still connected to Midas. Niklikan Tivim. Why is it called Tivim? I will say one more thing. Even when you contemplate on the ungodliness, not as in relation to our natural love, meaning that God is our Father and our source of sustenance, you also can say there are levels. You know, you can contemplate on God as creator and the wonder of creation and how everything is only a reflection. And it could still be on a level of Nehi. It could still be a mutfa level, not because it's wired in you, but it's a very basic contemplation. And then there can be a murgish where you get more passionate about it. And then even higher levels of passion. I'm just looking why he doesn't.
Does Tivim have to mean mutva? Is that where you're maybe caught up? I mean, it's one thing to say it's planted, it's embedded, which is nihi, versus Tivim. It's natural. It's natural for a human being to feel close to his father. It's natural for a human being to wonder what is the operation, the doings of the father. It's natural for the human being to wonder. In other words, do you have to connect Tivim to Mutva?
I think you just did by saying what you just said. You said it's natural. Tivim doesn't have to be Mutva, but the question is, what does Tivim mean?
Well, I mean, in modern Hebrew,
Tivim is Mutva. That's the same word.
Doesn't have to mean that.
It has to.
No, Mutva is a past participle of a verb, which means it's happened, it's planted, it's embedded. Tivim, yes, okay, I understand it's the same shoresh, but it doesn't have to mean they're not necessarily synonyms. Otherwise, he'd use the same word. He would say mutba'in, not tivim.
The same with
no, you call it kodid chilav tivim. He's connecting it to tivim for sure. Whether tivim and mutva is the same thing.
It's not even a question. Of course, they are the same.
Yeah, but then what is the difference in the murgish mitzad haseichel and what he said before, the chilav tivim?
Exactly.
Murgish mitzad haseichel is me'oider. It's magdil. It's a tivisdike thing. But if you have seichel,
yeah, but no. But if you look on page 1228. He made it clear that Tivim and Mutva is about God as your father and God as your source of sustenance, which is naturally embedded in our wiring. And Murgish Mitzad HaSeichel is contemplating about God's greatness in creation. Why would that? So I explained why that's called Tivim, because it's still talking about God as he relates to existence. So that's why it's called tivim. And yes, I did explain that it's not mutfa in that sense. But it seems that there's a connection between it. I'm not sure what it is. Anyway, I'm just going back to what I said before, that it's not 100% clear to me. I think it will become clear as we learn on. So I was just going to read a few lines and then we'll stop. It's already late here. So after the parentheses, he says, V'yesh b'zeh b'chinas katnus v'gadlus. In the hasag of his bonus itself, there's also levels. There's katnus, a less developed contemplation, and gadlus, a more developed or more mature contemplation. When a person is contemplating or understanding, God, we're talking about godliness now, the 4 different things he said in the previous page. So when he thinks about it or understands it in tzimtzum and miyut in a diminished and smaller way, so when he's thinking about it in a more limited way, the midas are then more revealed and more dominant and more felt and more sensed, because the mind is there, but the midas are still the dominant feature. Remember the natural, we'll explain that in a minute. That's called katnus, a less developed, smaller state. And the more the intelligence becomes more expansive, and the comprehension is greater and better, then the feelings are not that what's the word, morgish, not that concrete, not that concretized or felt. That's a state of godless. So I think that this is where he's entering now, that in his bonus itself, you're going to have different levels. And what he means by midas, murgish or not so murgish, but pashtus, he means the following. A child in general, the midas are more dominant. Child's emotions are more dominant than their intelligence. So even though a child, we're talking about now, I'm not talking about a baby. A child, let's say a 10-year-old. Even though a 10-year-old can listen and be disciplined and understands things, but still emotions are more dominant and more controlling. That's why they're not yet in a state where you can just rely that they're not going to get too emotional and overwhelmed by their emotions. So even when a child's thinking about godliness, it is still not bar mitzvah. You can't just say, okay, no matter how smart the child is. The more the seichel becomes developed and more powerful, the more the midas are kept at bay. Not to say we don't want to have passionate midas, but they're not naturally dominant. That's Pashtus what he's saying here. That like when seichel and midas, as a person grows, as the seichel gets stronger, the midas are more contained. As the seichel is less, the midas are less contained. That's what it seems like he's saying here. The thing is, how do we translate that in the divine terms? When you have less contemplation about godliness, what does it mean the midas are more b'murgish? It means it's still more the natural midah as opposed to the created one. That's not so clear, but we're in the middle of this. So don't worry that we don't understand it yet, because he's going to give a mashal and he's going to explain it. But clearly he's going into this area of understanding how the mind and the emotions interact with each other. So whatever we learn from Tanya and the tivim that we're speaking about, I think is going to become clearer as we learn on. But I will definitely get back to the parentheses because it's bothering me. I really want to understand what he means at the end there. But I think it'll be understood with what we learn now. Okay. So I just wanted to move on from after the parentheses and get into it, but clearly needs more explanation. So I make it very clear. I did not explain the whole piece yet. I would rather learn on and then we'll go and understand it. But still, if somebody